Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 155th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. My friends call me JAG. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fresh, creative ways, graphic novels, animated videos. Today, we are joined by Dr. Eamonn Butler. Before I even begin to introduce our guest, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, you can start using the comment section to type in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. So in a sense, you might say that we have two guests today. One is Adam Smith, the great Scottish Enlightenment economist and philosopher, born in 1723. And to celebrate the 300th anniversary of his birth, we've invited a friend who's better positioned than anyone I know to discuss Smith's life and legacy. Eamonn Butler is a British economist and co-founder of the Adam Smith Institute, a UK-based free market think tank. He is the author of countless articles and numerous books on a wide range of subjects, ranging from economics to psychology to politics. Some of his latest works include Ayn Rand, An Introduction, Capitalism, an introduction, and an introduction to democracy. Eamonn, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's very good to be with you. Thanks. Thanks very much for having me. Yeah.
So before turning to the birthday boy, I'm sure our audience would like to first start by learning a bit more about you, where you grew up, any early influences that motivated your passion for classically liberal ideas.
Well, I was born in rural Shropshire in England, and my parents together ran a small filling station. So I sort of grew up knowing what it was like to run a small business and all of the problems about small business. So I suppose that was a part of my education. And then I went to university in Scotland, and there was quite a big libertarian group, really, I think you'd call it. We read our Friedman and Hayek and Adam Smith, but we also read Ayn Rand. And that I think again was very influential. And then in the 1970s, when the economy was really going downhill at a rapid rate, I and colleagues followed a lot of other people by joining what was called the brain drain. So we went to America and found lots of interesting new ideas there. I worked on Capitol Hill for a while and taught for a while before I came back to help found the Adam Smith Institute.
So I actually hadn't realized that you'd worked in the U.S. House of Representatives back in the 1970s. Any interesting stories from that experience?
Well, two things spring to mind. As a very junior person, I had the dog's body job of reading the Federal Register, which is where all the new regulations are posted. And I realized that at the end of a year, I'd read 127,142 pages of regulation. And I thought, that's really a bit much, isn't it? I mean, nobody could possibly read all of that. Well, I could only skim it. I mean, nobody could read it, never mind understand it. So, why do you have all this regulation? I thought it was a very strange place. And the other thing which was very educational for me was the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill was going through Congress, and I read it, and I pointed out that, well, most of it is about subsidizing farmers, but then bolted on at the end is a piece about legislation about food stamps. And I said, well, food stamps is a welfare program, and the Farm Bill is a farm program. What's going on? And my colleagues looked at me as if I had come from Mars. I was an idiot. And they said, well, it's quite simple. All the Republicans vote for the farm subsidies, and all of the Democrats vote for the welfare benefits, so everybody's happy. And I said, well, yes, apart from the American taxpayer, perhaps. So I thought that sort of coalition building was something that we could use to reverse things when we came to the UK. And so in the UK, I got involved in privatization and things like that. And we used the same idea of building coalitions to reduce the state rather than to build it up.
All right. Well, I'm going to take a pause and remind everybody that we are taking your questions live. Dr. Butler is joining us from England, so it's a little bit later there, but let's start filling up the pantry with questions and we'll get to them shortly. So, Eamonn, you also taught philosophy at Hillsdale College. Obviously, philosophy is very important to us at the Atlas Society. Any particular aspect or philosopher that you favored?
Oh, well, I'm going to get into your bad books because really I taught the British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, these sorts of people who were skeptical about reality. So I think, and that was really the tradition that I was brought up in, having gone to university in Scotland. It's almost inevitable that you end up as a Scottish empiricist. And as was Hume and as was Adam Smith and so on. So that was really the tradition, and that's what I was bringing to the department, really. So I don't think Ayn Rand would have approved, but that's what I did.
Tell us about the story behind your decision to start the Adam Smith Institute and its mission, and whether that's changed over the years.
Well, it has changed. We thought we'd be much more academic than we are, and we're really more of a policy group, although we do some sort of research and long-term thinking. But as I say, there were three of us, in fact, who'd all joined the brain drain, gone to America. And when we were there, we saw some interesting things that we were told were impossible in the UK. I mean, for example, you had competition in telephones. And my economics professor in St Andrews University told me that was theoretically impossible. You couldn't have competition in telephones. And then similarly, we saw people like Senator Kennedy saying, oh, we should have a British-style national health service. And we thought, oh, no, that's the last thing you want. It's horrible. So we decided that, Britain was our country and we'd give it one more go. But what we would try to do is to swap ideas across the Atlantic. As it turned out, not very long after we came back, Mrs. Thatcher was elected in the UK. So we had a bit of an open goal to promote pro-freedom and free market policies here in the UK. And that's really been most of our work ever since.
Well, as one think tank leader to another, I'm curious to pick your brain on what has been the biggest challenge that you've found in running a world-class think tank.
Oh, it hasn't been a challenge, it's been a cakewalk. It's been very easy. I think, what you shouldn't underestimate, there were very few of us, and until recently, we remained very small. And you shouldn't underestimate what a few dedicated people with some vision can actually achieve. You can achieve an awful lot. I think the important thing is to keep your focus. That you've got to know what it is that you're doing and not be diverted. Over 40 years of running think tanks, I've seen think tanks come and go, and one of the things is, well, if people decide perhaps they might have more influence in politics, so they get too political, and then they get branded as being part of one party or another, and then nobody takes them seriously anymore. Or other think tanks, they think, oh, well, if we write a report on this subject, then big business will give us a lot of money. So again, you lose your soul there. So I think you've got to have a vision as to what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, and stick to that. My other rule is never do anything that you're not prepared to see on the front page of the newspapers, and that keeps you clean.
Yes, true more than ever these days in our mass surveillance state. So, in addition to writing about Adam Smith, you've written about other pioneering economists, including Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman. We've done a Draw My Life video on Von Mies, which, given his connection to Rand and his dramatic escape from the Nazis, of course, his own monumental achievements, it lent itself very well to that kind of project, an animated video that was encapsulated in a first-person narrative. What other economists or philosophers' life would you recommend to us for such a dramatization? I think you've said that Adam Smith's life was a bit boring, but he was kidnapped by gypsies at some point. So there's that.
It's said that he was kidnapped by vagrants, yes, and there's not really very much evidence for it, but it might have happened. And he was a typical absent-minded professor, and he would often be so bound up in his own thoughts he would walk out of the house in his dressing gown, and he didn't realize that he'd done that until the church bells from the village 10 miles away stirred him out of his self-absorption. And he also, one day when he was talking to somebody, put bread and butter in the teapot instead of tea. So these are really the most exciting things that ever happened to him. apart from, well, I mean, he did, once he published his first book, he got a very, very good job as tutor to a young aristocrat, and that took him around Europe, where he decided to write more about economics. So that really made him the economist. But otherwise, it was a pretty boring life. He never married and so on. No, I think a much more exciting person is actually from the 17th century. One of my particular favorites is called John Lilburne, English thinker. And he was known as Freeborn John because he thought that everybody was born free. And this was a revolutionary idea at the time. And he produced pamphlets on this, and pamphlets beating up the government for having too much control over people's lives, for which he was promptly put in prison because you couldn't publish anything in the 17th century unless you had a seal of approval from a government agency, basically the stationer's company. So he was put in prison for illicitly producing stuff. And then he was arraigned at the Star Chamber, which is a sort of secret court. And he famously refused to bow to the judges on the grounds that, he was in his role as the accused, they were in their role as the accusers, they were both doing their job, so why should he bow to anybody? And for that he was put in the stocks and whipped. And even in the stocks, as he was there in the stocks, he was handing out these pamphlets to passing members of the public. And so he spent, very large, and then he got put in jail again for something else. So he spent a very large part of his life in prison simply for defending freedom. I think it's a wonderful story.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to check that out. That has a lot of elements that I think we can work with. All right, we'll turn to the birthday boy now, Adam Smith, and the 300-year anniversary of his birth. In thinking about a man who influenced the thinking of so many, who were some of the people who influenced his thinking in his day?
Well, he was very lucky because he was born on the east coast of Scotland and spent some time in Edinburgh, where he met David Hume, the great philosopher, who I think was one of the cleverest people in all of history, and was a very nice avuncular man, and helped him enormously. In fact, Hume gave Adam Smith a copy of his book, The Treatise of Human Nature, and he was lucky Smith was lucky to go to Glasgow University, which he did at the age of 14, and he actually took Hume's book along with him, but was promptly punished because Hume was a great atheist, and this was thought to be terrible stuff, that you could have this book by this atheist. So Smith was punished for that. But otherwise, he met some of the great thinkers of his age, because Scotland was going through an intellectual renaissance. I think probably the biggest influence on him was the philosopher Francis Hutcheson, who, again, another philosopher of liberty. And I think that had a major impact. And then I think the other thing that I suppose influenced him was that he won a scholarship to go to Balliol College, Oxford. And he went to Balliol College, Oxford, and he discovered there that the professors got paid whether they taught or not. So he said famously, the greater part of the professors in Oxford have given up altogether even the pretense of teaching because they were paid whether or not. So I think that was probably quite an important influence on his life and ideas, and an early lesson in incentives, really.
Interesting. I didn't know that. All right, we're going to turn to questions in a little bit. So everybody keep on typing those in. I'm not ignoring you. We're going to get to you shortly. But I am curious, Eamonn, of Adam Smith's two major works, The Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments. Which is your favorite and why?
Well, I like the Theory of Moral Sentiments just mostly because people don't understand that that's Adam Smith. They think of Adam Smith as an economist. He was actually a brilliant philosopher, a moral philosopher as well. And that's the book that made his fortune, that made him famous. It's actually very difficult to read these days because if you don't know about the debates that were going on at the time, it's difficult to get through, and it's written in this very flowery 18th century language. So I don't actually recommend anybody should read it, and I don't recommend anybody should read the Wealth of Nations either. What you should do is to read my condensed version of the Wealth of Nations, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is much easier and much shorter. So that would give you most of the ideas without having to wade through these 500 or 800 page books.
Speaking of, what are some of the things that the Adam Smith Institute is doing to commemorate Adam Smith's 300th anniversary of his birth?
Well, being British, as you'd expect, we're going to have a booze up, and we're having a big party in the House of Lords later on this month, and I'm sure a lot of the good and the great will be there. I personally have been going around the world speaking about Adam Smith in California, in Europe, so I've just come back from Taiwan and Korea. So there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. And I'm helping people at the University of Glasgow who've got a big program, intellectual program, and courses and book clubs and all sorts of things like that going on. So there's a surprising amount going on all over the planet, actually.
Well, yes, indeed. We just got together in Pasadena, California, at the Reason Weekend, which had a theme of celebrating Adam Smith's birthday, even with Adam Smith cupcakes. So that was really exciting. Tell me, how controversial were Smith's works in his own day?
Well, I think his moral philosophy was unpopular with churchmen because he gives a sort of evolutionary explanation of morality, that it's that we're born wanting to be good to other people, basically, what he calls sympathy. And so I don't think they liked it very much. But otherwise, I think most people, certainly most educated people of the day, thought, hey, this guy is really on the beam, because his economic ideas were just breathtakingly new. He invented concepts like gross national product and things that we still use today. And his moral philosophy, again, it was just breathtakingly fresh, that nobody had thought of that before. So I don't know that he was all that controversial. I think he was fated wherever he went. It's like you asked about Adam Smith. No, it was easy for him. It was easy. He didn't have much controversy, and those that did were picking up minor points, I think, really.
Oh, well, that's interesting. All right. Going to turn to some of our questions coming in, because there are quite a few. On Instagram, Haydenburg25 is asking, Dr. Butler, have you ever read Marx? Any thoughts on Marx?
No, again, it's his books. I mean, you can open a page and look at it, and it's completely impenetrable. And again, I think that he's bound up in the debates of the time. I have read quite a lot of books about Marx's philosophy, and in particular his theory of history. And I think it's a load of junk. That, you know, he assumes that history has a certain course which is predictable, and that's going to end up in the great workers' nirvana. And I can't understand why this stuff is still clogging up university bookshops, because that didn't happen, right? You know, you had 150 years, and that didn't happen. What happened instead was that, you know, capitalism developed in such a way that it actually benefited the working class, indeed more than anybody else. So it was the poorest people who ended up, you know, just fine in capitalism, and that continues to happen today. We've got increasing world trade since the Berlin Wall came down, and the various reforms in the 1990s has brought people throughout the planet into the market system, and that's been particularly good for the poorest people in the poorest countries. I mean, dollar a day poverty. When I was born, 4/5 of the world lived in dollar a day poverty. Even by 1980, it was about half. And dollar a day poverty hardly exists anymore. And in a few years, it's not going to exist at all. And that's the market that's done that. So I think Marx's theory of history is just completely off.
Our friend Candace Morena on Facebook is asking, speaking of your upbringing with your parents running a small business, what is your perspective on the UK lockdowns during COVID?
Well, they were absolutely disastrous, of course. And we now know there's been various studies on it. John Hopkins did a big study showing that it saved very few lives, and in fact probably cost more lives, because what's happened here is, in particular, our public sector has closed down. That the supermarkets and shops and so on worked out ways of dealing with the virus, and trying to keep people as safe as possible. But we forced theatres and cafes and restaurants to close down. So that killed the hospitality, and hotels too. So that killed the hospitality industry. So we've got to recover from that. But the very worst thing is that the NHS, the National Health Service, simply couldn't cope with this, and they postponed lots of people's operations. And now people are dying of cancer and so on. We have 20,000 excess deaths because people couldn't get the medical treatment. They still can't get the medical treatment. Some people are having to wait for many years to get treatment under the National Health Service. So that all started from the lockdown, and so the lockdown was a complete disaster. And I think people are beginning to realize that it was a complete disaster. And the people who got it right were people like Sweden, who said, well, you know, take care, it's up to you, you know, just be cautious. And people were cautious, but they still went about their business, but they went about it in a relatively safe way. So yeah, it was disastrous in so many ways.
Okay, Sarah Giarchit on Instagram asks if you have any thoughts about Hans Hermann Hoppe.
I can't say that I like him very much. I don't know him personally, but
I'm not familiar with him. So
Hans Hermann Hoppe. Well, he's one of these people that is advertised as being a sort of Misesian libertarian, but in fact, there's a certain authoritarian streak through his writing. So I don't really like that very much. Having said that, I mean, some of his writing is very challenging. I mean, he wrote a book about democracy. I read it when I was doing my own introduction to democracy, And he's really saying, well, no, what you need is a benign aristocracy, really. And I thought, well, yes, okay, and he makes the case for this. That you need a country run by a king because they'll run it efficiently because that's their self-interest in doing that. I thought, well, that's, it's an interesting academic idea, but let's not go down there. So I'm not a great fan, I'm afraid.
Interesting. All right. Also on Instagram, Cozy Cherries asks, I'm not sure if you'll have an answer to this, but what is the best way we as Americans can fight socialism, communism? I feel hopeless not trusting our election process.
Well, I think that you have to. I think you have to be reasonable and not to be doctrinaire. I think one of the problems with American politics is when you know what somebody's position is on one issue, such as gun control, you know what it is on abortion and welfare benefits and various other things as well. And I don't think politics should be like that. I think people should think freely. And I think you've got the same problems that we have. We've got a culture war going on, and I think we have to deal with that. But I think you deal with that by just being reasonable and saying, well, yes, I mean, fine, people can change their gender, and I've got absolutely nothing against that at all. And I've got friends who've changed gender. But when it comes to should a male who's changed gender into female be allowed into a female changing room at a sports pavilion, well, you can see that might cause some problems. So, and people might get agitated about that. So I think that one needs sort of rational solutions to these things and tempered solutions to these things. So I think my advice is don't be doctrinaire, but be practical and see what works. And I think also we need to invest in the education of young people. I mean, not by having more teachers, they're the enemy, but by getting good stuff out, like you do at Atlas, to getting good material out, which is digestible to young people. It's why I write all these introductions to things, and so that they've got something they can go back to the teachers and say, yeah, well, have you thought about this though, this argument here? So I think it's very important to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really admire about your work, Eamonn, is the fact that you've done so many of these primers, these kind of condensed introductions. It's similar to what we do at the Atlas Society in terms of our pocket guides, Pocket Guide to Objectivism, Pocket Guide to Capitalism, Pocket Guide to Socialism, etc. Because one needs to first start with the premises and recognize reality. And the reality is that 77% of young people in the 1970s were reading daily for pleasure, not things that were assigned. That is dropped to 12% today. So you can just keep throwing books at them, or you can get creative and you can start doing other things. And graphic novels is the one category that has defied the decline in reading for pleasure, and so that's why we're doing that. But you just have to change with the times.
Oh yes, and I think we ought to, on our side, I think we ought to be doing a lot more video work as well. I've been trying to organize a TV documentary on the real history of communism, because so many young people in particular think that communism is the bee's knees, and gosh, it killed 100 million people. So it's not something you should welcome. And the trouble is, of course, that most of the people who remember it are dying off. So we've got to get their testimony onto film right now. Otherwise, it'll be too late. So things like that. I think we need to tell more stories on film, and your graphic novels, things like that, is what we need to do. Yeah, the media have changed, right? look at an old copy of a newspaper and it's very dense print, and people used to read all that stuff, and they don't do that now.
No,
And
no, I mean, people are online 9 hours a day, average for young people.
People get their information through social media and so on. So you have to be active on social media. It's very important.
All right, on Twitter, speaking of social media, Mark Kirkcop asks, he says there's a big meme online about the UK requiring a license for everything. Are licenses a long-time economic regulation in the UK?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's a real problem. In fact, we did a report called Licensed to Live. The opposite of the James Bond, License to Kill. And that was, gosh, that must have been at least 20 years ago. And we were pointing out some of the absurdities of licensing, like you needed a license to be a hairdresser in Scotland, but not in England, and so on. So there are all sorts of things like that. I think part of the problem is that professions like licensing because it keeps out the competition, you see. So if you can say, oh, I'm an expert and I've got this diploma and I've got a license, then you can say, right, well, people without licenses shouldn't be allowed to practice. So you get much less competition and therefore much less innovation. So that's a real problem. But yes, it is with us. And so much regulation is actually promoted by entrenched business interests. And I see it over and over and over again in the House of Commons, where businesses are talking to members of Parliament and they say, oh, these regulations are working very well, Minister, but if you just tweaked it a little bit like that, it will work even better. What they mean is tweak it like that, and that'll completely take out the competition. So it's something we have to be aware of, and it's not very easy to fight because every regulation is there for a reason, that it's had people promoting it. And when you say this should be scrapped, people come out of the woodwork and say, oh no, you can't do that. No, that'll make life unsafe and people will fall off ladders or whatever it is. And so it's a real burden to get rid of. And I think the only way to do it is basically deregulate whole swathes of things at one time. And you say to Parliament, in our case, right, we've got a deregulation unit. They think that all of these regulations ought to go, and that's it. Take it or leave it. You can't pick and choose. They've all got to go or they've all got to stay. And I think Parliament would end up killing a lot more. And after Brexit, we've got the opportunity to get rid of a lot of European regulation, which is extremely detailed. And we haven't really taken the opportunity. We haven't been organized enough. So that's a benefit of Brexit, which we've still got to feel.
Lots to do. Again, on Instagram, Robert Stephen Mack asks, what is your favorite book by Ayn Rand?
Oh, The Fountainhead, I think, which is the first one that I read. I think it's a more believable story than Atlas Shrugged. I think it's still bizarre. I mean, the main characters are quite bizarre people, and it's remarkable that anybody should be as dogmatic about sticking to their principles as Rourke is. So it's difficult from that point of view, but it says what it's got to say very clearly, and it's uplifting, and it's not too much full of caricature like I think Atlas Shrugged is. So I think that would be my favorite. Yeah.
Philip Coates on Zoom is asking you if you could only read one economist as a layman, who would it be?
No, that's a difficult one.
Yeah. And he's also asking, if you're familiar with George Reisman and his magnum opus, Capitalism, a treatise on economics, how it compares to.
Yeah, well, I know George Reisman a bit. So yes, it's a very good book. Yes, and he's a good person. I think one economist, I would say Milton Friedman, because Milton Friedman was the great communicator. I keep on saying that F.A. Hayek was, I think, the wisest person that I've ever known personally, but I think Friedman was the sharpest. He was very quick. He was very, very good in debate. Always relished debate. He debated people who utterly opposed him with a big smile on his face, and that comes through in his writing. So. His economic work is mostly about monetary policy, which is a bit dense for most of us. But then in things like Capitalism and Freedom, and Free to Choose in particular, he starts applying liberal free market, liberal in the European sense, free market, pro-liberty thinking to all sorts of economic issues. And I think that's very instructive, and it's something that a lay person can get to grips with. So yeah, Milton Friedman.
All right. Zach Carter on Twitter is asking, your book, The Condensed Wealth of Nations, is unavailable on Amazon. How can we
even better, it's free online. If you go to adamsmith.org, our website, it's on there, and it's free online.
All right, we'll put the link in all of the chat streams.
Sure.
Again, Philip Coates on Zoom is saying, I believe Thomas Sowell wrote a basic economics text and a condensation of Marxism. Any thoughts on his writing in general, or on these two subjects?
Well, I can't comment on that particular book because I don't know enough about it. But Tom Sowell was I think a very brave man. Who raised some very interesting issues about welfare in the United States and things like that, and asked some very pertinent questions about it. So I'm a great fan, a nice guy too, and so I'm a great fan of his, and I think again his work is very readable. You can read it. Even without a great background in economics, although he was a very accomplished economist. So yeah, I'd recommend him to anybody.
All right, on YouTube, Scott is talking about The Outlander. I guess it's a series. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's about to return for a new season, which shared a lot of 18th century Scottish culture, and asking, do you think that period of integration into the UK helped to inspire the Scottish Enlightenment?
Oh yes, undoubtedly it did. That once after the Act of Union in 1707, then it was much easier for people in Scotland to trade with England, for a start. Very important, and it was also much easier for people in Scotland to travel to England. So they did that, and they picked up lots of new ideas, and they came back and they thought about these new ideas and worked on them, and it was a very important part of the Scottish Enlightenment. It's a bit like, Daniel Burstein wrote a book about the cultural frontier, and he was saying that. You need to come up against other cultures in order to spark ideas and get out of your existing way of doing things. And I think that is very important. I mean, whenever I travel, I always pick up, innumerable ideas about, well, why don't we do things better? Why don't we do it this way rather than that way? And I think the same was true in the 18th century in Scotland. And that really culminated, I think, in 1822 when we had a visit to Scotland by George IV, showing that yes, Scotland was now a proper nation. It was no longer a northern wild place. It was an intellectual powerhouse. So and it produced Smith and Hume and lots of other great intellectuals who influenced the English intellectuals like Joshua Reynolds and Samuel Johnson and people like that. It was a great, intellectually, a great time to be alive.
All right, I'm going to turn back to some of my questions, but I want to grab this one from Ann M. on YouTube. What is a story of Adam Smith's life that most people don't know?
Well, there we are. Well, I think most people probably don't realize that he never married. And it's said
Was
that
that unusual in his day?
yeah, well, Joshua Reynolds didn't marry either, I don't think, but most other people did. Yes, that's right. And I think it was perfectly normal, but he didn't. I think he was probably too much of a sort of academic somehow to do that. He lived most of his life with his mother, and when she died, it was a female cousin who looked after him. And I think probably somebody had to, because I don't know that he was great at navigating his way through
Putting his
life.
toast in his teapot.
All that kind of thing. Yes, that's right. And he fell into a tanning pit once because he wasn't looking where he was going, and so on. But so I think somebody had to look after him. So I think people don't really understand that part of his character. But at the same time, he was hugely respected by everybody that he met. When he published his theory of moral sentiments in 1759, he was basically headhunted by the stepfather of a young aristocrat, and he was given a very handsome salary, something like, I don't know, $200,000 these days, to tutor this kid. Oh, plus a lifetime pension, and another $100,000 for life. And so it was a very generous deal, and he could hardly refuse. So he said to the students that he was teaching at St Andrews, at Glasgow rather, I'm very sorry, I've got to leave the course halfway through, and but I've worked out how much money I owe you all, because then the students paid the teachers directly. And I put these little parcels, and there's a name on it, and each person can collect their parcel. And so he's handing out these parcels of money to his students, but they snuck around the back of him and put it back in their pockets. They're just saying, "No, we've had absolutely fantastic value, even though we only did half the year. It was still worth the money."
Speaking of so he went to tutor this young son of an aristocrat.
Yeah, he was only
Yeah.
12, 14 at the
How
time.
did that young man turn out?
Oh, great! He fulfilled his ducal duties just as you would expect, and I think and he maintained a lifetime friendship with Adam Smith, which actually still runs in the family. I've met and stayed with the current Duke of Buccleuch, who is very proud of his ancestor and very proud of the connection that he has with Adam Smith through that. And he even has a copy of The Wealth of Nations, and on the flyleaf in a very scrawny hand, it says, to the Duke of Buccleuch from the author. So that was Adam Smith giving his patron the first copy of the book. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. All right, turning to the United States, any examples of how Smith influenced America's founders?
Well, they all read it. I've seen a copy of the first edition of The Wealth of Nations, and there's the signature Alexander Hamilton on the flyleaf. It was his personal copy. So I think they all read it. And I think that it helped them to build a liberal constitution. Again, liberal in the European sense, I'm sorry. So a constitution based on freedom and liberty. He wasn't so successful at getting them to reduce taxes on trade, which was the big theme of the Wealth of Nations, really because the fledgling United States needed the money. And so they put a lot of tariffs on trade in order to raise money to keep the state going after the Revolutionary War. So it was a while before they followed the tax advice, but in terms of the framing your constitution, I think, yes, he was very influential in that, as he was in many, many other countries.
Amazing.
It was a bestseller,
All right. Well, despite his admiration for the American colonies, he was also an outspoken critic of the slave trade and the mistreatment of Native Americans. Is that right?
Oh, yes, absolutely, definitely. Firstly, he thought, as an economist, he thought that it was bad economics that if you have to force people to work, you can't really expect them to do a very good job. You're going to get a better job out of free people who enjoy what they're doing. So he thought it was bad economics. And a lot of people have caricatured him as being, oh, well, he was only against the slave trade because it was bad economics. But that's not true. He was deeply against it morally as well. And he writes, very heartfelt terms about how the slave trade, the slaves themselves have far more nobility in them than any of the down and outs who are the traders in slave. And he was very scathing of the people who dealt in the slave trade. And again, I think that, well, among other intellectual influences, is one of the reasons why Britain was one of the first countries, along with Sweden, to stamp out the slave trade. And indeed, many Royal Navy lives were sacrificed trying to prevent that trade from going ahead. So I think it was a very, very influential book, The Wealth of Nations, where this appears, and everybody read it. All of the aristocracy read it. All of the top politicians read it, and yes, it had an effect.
What are some of the more common fallacies today about Adam Smith? For example, the idea that he favored progressive taxation.
No, he favored there are several of these, but he favored a tax on consumption, really, rather than income, because he thought that, yes, richer people should pay more, but you could do that through consumption because they consume more, and therefore you could have a flat tax on consumption, and you'd end up with the aristocratic, the richer people, paying more tax. So I think that's a fallacy, and I think that the idea that he was sort of so laissez-faire, he was devil take the hindmost, if you like. That he was a ruthless pro-capitalist, and therefore, if you couldn't match up, then that was the problem. So that was your problem. So I think that instead, he was deeply concerned for the lot of the ordinary working people. And his view was that a free economy liberates ordinary working people. It liberates the poorest. What the problem was in his time, and the problem is in our time, is that you've got an economy which is dominated by vested interests, and they try to keep everybody else out of their business, out of their market. And therefore, what happens is that ordinary people can't get a look in, so they can't use their talents to improve their own lives and that of their family. So yes, I'm sort of motivated. One of the reasons I believe in free markets, again, is the same. That I'm interested in the plight of the working poor, and I think they're getting a very bad deal from all of the regulations and taxation that's imposed on them.
Now, some Marxists say that Karl Marx got his labor theory of value partially from Adam Smith. Any truth in that?
Well, it's possible. I think this is probably a misreading of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, it's in a passage where he's talking about the development of the economy, and he really starts by looking at an age in which he thinks, well, there's no capital at all. And therefore, if it takes you twice as much time to hunt a deer as to hunt a beaver, then a deer must be worth twice as much. But if you look at, and people have said, oh, well, that's a labor theory of value, and Marx picked that up. Rothbard says this. I knew Murray Rothbard, and he was a great controversialist, but and that's a step too far. Marx got his ideas from all sorts of different places. If you look at all the rest of the Wealth of Nations, it's all about supply and demand, and it's all about value up here, and so the idea that Smith really promoted a labor theory of value, it's a misfortune. And in a big book, there's lots of things that are inconsistent, and maybe it would be better if he put it another way. But I don't think you can actually pin that one on him.
All right. Any speculation about why Smith wanted his personal papers destroyed after his death?
It wasn't that uncommon at the time. And I think you must remember that Smith died a very famous man. He was known around the world. And I think he didn't want his reputation to be trashed on the basis of maybe something that he'd half finished, or, a letter to a friend where he said something indiscreet, that sort of thing. And therefore he decided that, with very few exceptions, all of his papers should be burned. It's a misfortune for us, because I'm sure that there would be interesting insights. And in particular, I always say Adam Smith wasn't an economist; he was a social psychologist. He wrote about moral theory. He wrote about economics, and he also wrote a little bit and lectured on arts and culture and the use of language. And I think that he had it in mind to produce a book on politics and another one on justice. And I think it would be fascinating to see if there were in his pictures, in his papers, some notes or thoughts on those subjects. I think they would be absolutely fascinating, but sadly, they've gone up in smoke.
All right, we've got just 9 more minutes, but of course, this interview wouldn't be complete without a couple of questions about Ayn Rand. For the past 9 years or so, the Adam Smith Institute has organized an annual Ayn Rand lecture in London, which I had the privilege of attending back in 2016 when you and I first met. One of the Atlas Society's supporters, Dr. Michael Kaufman, has delivered the lecture, as did a recent guest on this podcast, Lars Tved. What is your vision for the lecture series? How do you pick your speakers?
Well, what we look for is people who have been influenced by Ayn Rand, but who have brought that influence into business. So instead of getting political thinkers and philosophers and so on, what we've been getting largely is business people who've been influenced by Rand, and basically whose values in business, if you like, have been shaped by their reading of Ayn Rand. So they understand about rational self-interest. They understand about building a reputation, and they understand about being confident in yourself. And I think that's the formula seems to work very well. So we always pack out one of these big City of London, very fancy livery halls, they're called, set up by the guilds, which we disapprove of, but set up by the guilds in the 18th century. And so we always pack the house, and I think it's a series which is going to continue. So we need Fantastic. More suggestions for speakers, but apart from that.
Well, perhaps we can help.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about your primer, Ayn Rand, an introduction. Did you learn anything new in preparing it, or were you pretty well versed in the subject already?
Well, I think with all the primers I do them partly as a measure of self-education, because so many people and so many subjects, I don't know whether it's capitalism or democracy or anything else, inequality, all the other things I've written on, I know a little bit about, but I think, well, I really would like to know more about that. And so it's partly done for my benefit rather than the readers. So I think I learned a lot about Adam Smith, because I didn't really know much about him at the time. We took him as the name of the Institute because it kind of sums up what we believe in. But at the same time, I didn't really know much about man and his thought other than the Wealth of Nations. So I learned a lot about that. But that's true of every other subject I've written on. It's you learn a lot when you have to write about it.
Well, I highly recommend them, and I like that a couple of them are on audio. I just listened a couple of times to your primer on Hyatt, so that was really enlightening. Quick question about modern day UK. Really confused by what happened with Liz Truss's short time as Prime Minister. She seemed to advocate some free market ideas, but the markets reacted very negatively to her proposal. So what was that all about?
Well, I know Liz very well, and she's always been a great hero of mine. But I think she wanted to reduce taxation, and I think that's absolutely vital, and I think we should have done that. At the same time, she inherited from Boris Johnson a package of a bailout package for homeowners to help with their energy bills. And that was extremely expensive. So I think they thought that her administration thought that, well, that's already been decided. We can't do anything about that. And by the way, everybody else is doing it. Germans are doing it. Everybody else around the planet is helping out with energy bills, helping householders. So it's not very controversial. So we'll carry on. So we'll cut taxes and we'll just borrow whatever it takes to carry on. And I think the markets were a little bit jittery about that, but things were made even worse by the establishment. The Bank of England gave her almost no support at all. The Treasury bureaucrats were openly hostile. It all came to grief, unfortunately, and it's a great misfortune, because if you're facing a recession, you really do have to cut taxes. We've got to grow and create new businesses, and the one thing which kills new businesses and stops people starting new businesses is the idea that, well, even if they succeed in starting a new business, they're going to get whacked by, in our case, 25% company tax, plus income tax, plus national insurance, plus all the rest. So that really stops you from developing new business, and then you can't recover. So you get in that downward spiral that we were in the 1970s, which induced me and other people to go abroad.
Well, speaking of going abroad, as we were mentioning before, you've been to the US, South Korea, Portugal. What's next for you? Where are you going? How can we keep track of your work?
Well, I was rather hoping to put my feet up. I might be going to France to do the summer university there. I'm not sure. I was sort of thinking about doing a meeting in South Africa. I'm not sure I'm going to do that. I'm certainly going to be in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in the end of October. But other than those, I haven't the faintest idea. If somebody wants to invite me, I'll go.
We have a standing invitation here in Malibu. So thank you, Eamonn. This has been great. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other materials, consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org. And be sure to tune in next week when hotel magnate and former ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, will be our guest on the Atlas Society Asks to talk about his book, The Envoy, Mastering the Art of Diplomacy with Trump and the World. So we'll see you next week.